The Mafia Boss sent a body to the fat medical examiner. She found the evidence that proved his own man did it. Then she refused to sign. The message arrived the way these messages always arrived, not directly, never directly, but through the specific chain of intermediaries that insulated the request from its origin with sufficient distance that no single link in the chain could describe the full picture of what was being asked and by whom. A phone call to a contact who called another contact, who left a message with the night supervisor at the Cook County Medical Examiner's office that a case coming in that evening would benefit from a finding of accidental death in the context of an unknown altercation. The night supervisor had passed this along to Dr. Serena Cole with the specific, flattened affect of a man delivering information he preferred not to be responsible for, and she had received it with the specific, flattened affect of a woman who had worked in this building for 12 years and understood, with complete clarity, what the message was and what it was asking. The first time she had received such a message, she had been 28, 4 years into her work at the office, and she had gone home that evening and sat at her kitchen table for 3 hours thinking about it, with the thorough, systematic attention she brought to difficult things. She had thought about her colleagues who had taken similar paths. She knew 2 of them personally, knew the specific, gradual change in them over the years, the way their professional confidence had hollowed slightly, the way they held themselves differently when certain topics arose, the specific, recognizable quality of a person managing something they could not fully acknowledge. She had thought about what her mother would say, and what her father would say, and about the bodies that came through the office and could not speak for themselves. And she had arrived, by the end of that 3 hours, at a position that she had maintained without significant reconsideration for 8 years since. She had received similar messages before, not frequently, but enough times to have developed a position on them, and her position had not changed in 12 years. She said nothing to the night supervisor. She put on her gloves. She began. What she found in the course of the next 3 hours was not what anyone had sent the body to her office expecting her to find. It was something considerably more specific and considerably more dangerous, and it pointed not outward, toward the enemies and rivals and unknown actors that the message had implied, but inward, toward the specific, intimate world of the man who had sent the message in the first place. She completed her examination. She wrote her report. She wrote it accurately, completely, and without modification, the way she wrote every report, and she signed her name to it, and she waited for what came next. Dr. Serena Cole had chosen forensic pathology at the age of 24, in her 3rd year of medical school, for a reason she had explained to very few people, and that most of those people had found either morbid or inexplicable. She had chosen it because the dead could not be pressured into changing their testimony. She was 36 now, and she had been the senior medical examiner in the Cook County office for 4 years, and she had found, over 12 years of working with the dead, that her original reasoning had been both correct and incomplete. The dead could not be pressured, but the people who interpreted what the dead had to say could be pressured consistently by a variety of mechanisms, and the pressure was most effective on the people who had the most to lose: debts, ambitions, family members in vulnerable positions, the specific accumulated weight of a life built on something that could be taken away. She was 5'8" and 245 pounds, with the broad, solid build that had led her high school basketball coach to describe her, memorably, as immovable. A description she had found accurate not in reference to her athletic performance, but in reference to something more constitutional, something that had made her a difficult child and an excellent forensic pathologist. She wore her hair in box braids she refreshed every 6 weeks, wore no jewelry in the examination room, wore reading glasses she had not yet replaced with a prescription that reflected the deterioration in her close vision that she had been noting for approximately 8 months, and addressing through the time-honored medical professional method of ignoring it. She had grown up in Englewood, on the south side of Chicago, In a neighborhood that produced, with the specific statistical regularity of a system working as designed, a disproportionate number of the bodies that arrived at the medical examiner's office. She had understood this from a young age, not abstractly, but specifically, had grown up in proximity to the particular texture of lives curtailed suddenly, of families whose mornings changed between breakfast and dinner, of a community that contained, within its ordinary geography of houses and churches and schools and corner stores, an unusually high number of people who had learned to hold grief with the practiced, unflinching quality of those for whom it was not an exceptional condition, but a recurring one. Her mother had been the high school chemistry teacher who told her, at 14, that the most important thing you could do with a brain like hers was to find the thing it was built for and do it as well as it could possibly be done. Her father had been the postal worker who told her, at 16, that the people who ended up doing the most important work in the world were frequently not the people who had set out to do important work, but the people who had simply decided early on that they would do their particular job as completely and as honestly as it could be done, and that completeness and honesty, sustained over a long enough period, produced something more valuable than ambition ever did. She had carried both pieces of advice into medical school, and then into her residency in forensic pathology, and then into the Cook County Medical Examiner's office, where she had spent 12 years becoming the person her father had described. Not someone who had set out to matter, but someone who had decided to do her specific job as completely and as honestly as it could be done, and who had found over time that this decision was both entirely simple and the most demanding thing she had ever undertaken. She had grown up on the south side of Chicago, the daughter of a postal worker and a high school chemistry teacher, in a household where the specific discipline of paying attention to what was actually true, rather than what was convenient or comfortable or socially expected to be true, had been communicated not through explicit instruction, but through the daily, consistent example of two people who lived that way themselves. Her mother had had a phrase for the alternative, for the adjustments and omissions and subtle distortions that people applied to inconvenient truths to make them more manageable. She had called it arranging the furniture around the leak. The leak was still there. The furniture was just positioned so you could pretend you did not see it. Serena had spent 12 years in a profession that produced, regularly and without apology, inconvenient truths, and she had developed a relationship with this aspect of the work that was not comfortable exactly, but was deeply functional. The relationship of someone who has decided that her particular job in the world is to say what the dead have to say, accurately and completely, and that the consequences of this job were the consequences of this job, and were not a reason to do the job differently. She had, in 12 years, built a professional life that looked from the outside like a series of unexceptional choices, the same office, the same function, the same quiet authority in a field that most people preferred not to think about. What it looked like from the inside was different, a series of the same choice made repeatedly, in different contexts and under different pressures, each time arriving at the same conclusion until the conclusion was no longer a decision, but a characteristic, no longer something she chose in the moment, but something she was. She thought about this occasionally, about the relationship between the choices you made repeatedly and the person you became through making them. She thought it was the most accurate way to understand what character was. Not a quality you possessed or did not possess, but a direction you moved in consistently enough that the direction became the thing, became who you were in a way that was no longer available for revision without becoming someone else entirely. She had chosen this direction at 24, and she had moved in it through 12 years of cases, and she was the person that movement had made her, for better and for worse, and without significant regret. She had worked 3 separate shifts under 3 separate supervisors, had watched colleagues take the path of least resistance at various crossroads of professional integrity, had observed, without judgment but with careful attention, that the people who took that path did not tend to become happier or safer over time, but rather accumulated a specific kind of debt that they paid in the gradual erosion of their own self-conception, until the person they had been when they entered the profession was barely legible in the person they had become. She had decided at 24 that she would not pay that debt, and each decision she had made since then was a renewal of the same refusal rather than a new decision. She had received messages like the one that arrived on the night of November 14th before. She had received them in various forms and through various channels, always with the same underlying structure. A finding was expected, a specific finding that aligned with a specific interest, and the implication, never stated, never direct, always deniable, was that aligning her professional conclusions with this interest would be the path of least resistance for everyone involved. She had never taken this path. This was not heroism. She was careful to think about it clearly, and heroism was not the accurate category. Heroism implied risk undertaken in service of something larger than oneself, a moral calculation made under duress. What she did was simpler and, she thought, more sustainable. She had decided, at the beginning of her career, what her job was, and she had never encountered a reason compelling enough to change that decision. And each time she made the same choice, it was simply the continuation of a prior choice, rather than a new act of courage. The night supervisor had passed along the message at 11:15. The body had arrived at 11:40. She had taken 3 minutes between the arrival and the beginning of her work, which was not standard. She typically began immediately, and she had used those 3 minutes to stand in the corridor outside the examination room and think about what she was about to do, not because she was uncertain about it, but because she had learned over 12 years that taking a moment to be fully conscious of a choice before making it was different from hesitating. Hesitation was indecision in motion. What she was doing was something else. The deliberate act of meeting a choice clearly, with full awareness of its nature, before committing to it. She had made this choice before, in smaller ways, and she was making it again now in what was, she could already tell, a somewhat larger way, and she wanted to make it eyes open, rather than on autopilot. She stood in the corridor for 3 minutes. Then she put on her gloves and went in. She had begun work at 11:43. The man on her table was young, mid-20s at most, possibly younger, with the specific physical development of someone who had grown up in environments that required a certain kind of readiness. Broad through the shoulders and chest, hands that showed the evidence of labor rather than office work. He was dressed in clothes that were neither expensive nor cheap, the unmarked middle register of someone who did not want to be remembered for what he was wearing. He had dark hair and the olive complexion of Southern European ancestry, and he had a single gunshot wound to the chest that the paramedics' initial report characterized as the likely cause of death, sustained in what a witness had described as a drive-by shooting in the Bridgeport neighborhood at approximately 9:30 that evening. Serena read the paramedics' report. She noted its contents. She set it aside and looked at the body with her own eyes, which was the correct sequence. The first thing she noted was the entry wound. Drive-by shootings produced a specific wound profile. The geometry of a bullet fired from a moving vehicle at a moving or stationary target through intervening air and, usually, a car window or open window aperture. The combination of factors producing a characteristic pattern of tissue disruption and powder residue distribution that she had seen many times and could read as reliably as a paragraph of text. What she was looking at was not this pattern. The entry wound was too clean, the edges too defined, the surrounding tissue too undisturbed by the intermediate factors that complicated drive-by wound profiles. She noted this. She continued. The powder stippling was the second thing. Gunshot residue around a wound told a story about distance. The farther the firearm, the more the residue dispersed before reaching the target, producing a wider, fainter pattern. The closer the firearm, the denser and more concentrated the stippling. What she was seeing on the skin around the entry wound was not the dispersed, wide pattern of a shot fired from a moving vehicle at street distance. It was the dense, concentrated pattern of a shot fired from considerably closer than a vehicle. From a distance, she estimated as she worked, of somewhere between 12 and 18 inches. Someone had stood very close to this man and shot him in the chest. Someone he had been close enough to allow within 18 inches of his body, which meant someone he had not been afraid of, which meant someone he had trusted. She noted this in her working document. She continued. She worked methodically, in the order the examination required, not rushing any phase because the phases were sequential for reasons that had been worked out over decades of forensic practice, and skipping ahead or compressing the sequence was the kind of efficiency that produced errors. She was aware that the clock on the wall showed 2:25, that the night was very late, that the examination room was quiet except for the ambient hum of the building's systems and the occasional distant sound of the building's front entrance opening and closing as other staff came and went. She was aware of all of this with the peripheral attention she maintained for environmental information, and she set it aside, because none of it was relevant to the work in front of her. The bullet was the third thing, and the third thing was the one that changed the nature of the evening. The bullet was unusual. Not rare, she had seen this caliber before, but in specific contexts, in the bodies of specific categories of people, and the context it had appeared in most consistently over her 12 years was the bodies of people whose deaths were connected to the organized operations of the city's more significant criminal organizations, which used certain equipment because certain equipment had particular properties suited to their specific operational requirements. She photographed the bullet. She documented its characteristics in exact technical terms. She cross-referenced her own memory and her own documentation, and she arrived at the same conclusion from 3 different directions. This man had not been killed in a drive-by shooting by an unknown attacker in the Bridgeport neighborhood. He had been killed deliberately, at close range, by someone he trusted, using a firearm associated with a very specific professional context. She was, she understood, now in a different kind of case. Not different in its forensic requirements. She would work through the examination with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything, but different in its implications. Different in what she understood to be waiting at the other end of the documentation she was producing. She was writing something that contradicted a narrative that powerful people had already decided upon. She was writing it alone, in a building that was quiet at this hour, with a report that would be filed in a system that was not entirely insulated from the pressures that had produced the message at 11:15. She did not let this alter her pace or her precision. She had thought about this possibility, had been thinking about it since she first recognized what the wound profile was telling her, had run the calculation with the complete honesty she applied to everything, and she had arrived at the same place she always arrived. Her job was to write what the evidence said. Everything else was someone else's department. She documented everything. She worked through the rest of the examination with the same thorough attention she brought to every examination, because the rest of the examination was also part of the record and might matter in ways she could not yet fully see. She noted other details, a healed injury on the left hand that suggested a previous significant trauma, a tattoo on the inner right wrist that she photographed and documented without analysis, because analysis of its significance was not her function. The specific pattern of defensive posturing in the body's musculature that suggested he had seen the weapon before it fired, but had not attempted to flee. He had seen it coming. He had not run. He had trusted the person holding the gun. At approximately 1:30 in the morning, she identified the deceased. She had not been given his name when the body arrived, which was itself a deviation from standard procedure that she had noted and documented without comment. The identification came through the fingerprint database, cross-referenced against a second database, producing a name that she had heard before in the specific, oblique way that names of significance in the city's less visible operational landscape circulated, in case files, in reports that crossed her desk in connection with other bodies, in the careful, peripheral vocabulary of a profession that worked at the intersection of the legal and the illegal without belonging fully to either. Marco Costa, 24 years old, listed in one law enforcement database as a known associate of the Costa organization. She sat with this for a moment. She thought about the message that had arrived at 11:15, and about the chain of intermediaries through which it had traveled, and about the specific conclusion that chain had been designed to produce, and she thought about the fact that the man who had initiated that chain was, almost certainly, the uncle of the young man on her table, who had been killed by someone he trusted, and whose death was now being organized into a convenient narrative by the people who should have been most invested in the truth of what had happened to him. Then she finished her report. She wrote it exactly as the evidence required it to be written. The wound characteristics, the powder stippling analysis, the bullet documentation, the conclusion that death had resulted from a single close-range gunshot wound inflicted by a known associate rather than an unknown attacker in the context described by the initial witness report. She wrote it in the precise, technical, unambiguous language of someone whose job was to say what the evidence said, and she signed her name to it, and she placed it in the case file, and she sat at her desk and waited. She did not have to wait long. If you are sitting with what Serena Cole has just done, if you understand what it means to sign your name to a true thing when a powerful man expected a different thing, then you need to stay with this story, because what walks through the door of the Cook County Medical Examiner's office at 2:15 in the morning is the beginning of the most dangerous and most important 48 hours of her professional life. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the notification bell. Do not miss what comes next. Dominic Costa arrived at 2:15 in the morning. He did not call ahead. He did not send a representative. He came himself. Dominic Costa was 47 years old and had led the Costa organization for 19 years, having come to the position at 28 in the specific way that men came to such positions in such organizations, which was through a combination of demonstrated capability, family lineage, and a particular quality of resolve that had distinguished him from his peers since early in his career. He was known, in the precise and limited way that knowledge circulated about men of his standing, as deliberate and methodical, as a man who did not act before he understood a situation completely, who preferred to wait for certainty rather than act on probability, and who had built his reputation for reliability on the consistent application of these qualities over 2 decades. He was also known as a man who managed the deaths of people in his organization with a specific, particular attention, not a sentimental attention, not the melodramatic grief of lesser men in comparable positions, but the careful, complete attention of someone who understood that the deaths of his people were his responsibility and required him to account for them, to understand them, to ensure that they meant what they were supposed to mean within the structure he had built. He did not lose people carelessly. When he lost people, he understood why, and the understanding was not separate from the loss, but inseparable from it. Marco Costa had been his sister Rosa's only child. He had known Marco since the boy was born, had watched him grow up in the specific, close-quartered way of families embedded in an organization where professional and personal life were not fully distinguishable categories, had had Marco around him in various capacities since the boy was old enough to be useful in the peripheral ways that young men were useful, before they were ready for anything more central. He had been planning, in a general and not yet formalized way, to have a conversation with Marco about his future, about whether the organization was what he wanted, about whether there were other paths that would suit him better, about the particular latitude that a young man with a powerful uncle had if he wanted to take it. He had not had that conversation yet. He did not call ahead. He did not send a representative. He came himself, which told her something, though she had not yet fully assembled what it told her. He was accompanied by two men who positioned themselves outside the examination room door with the practiced, unobtrusive competence of people whose function was protection rather than presence, and he came into the room alone, which told her something else. He was, she registered in the moment before she composed her expression into the professional neutrality she maintained in all encounters with people who had arrived at her office under these circumstances, an exceptionally large man. She had thought, in the hours between his first departure and this arrival, about what she knew of Dominic Costa, which was what anyone who read newspapers carefully and worked adjacent to the city's law enforcement infrastructure for 12 years would know, which was not much, but was not nothing. She knew the outlines of what he represented. She knew enough to understand that his arriving at her office in person rather than sending someone was a meaningful choice in the context of how men in his position typically communicated with public officials at 2 a.m. She knew that men in his position arrived in person when they wanted to communicate something that intermediaries could not fully communicate, which was usually some version of, "I am paying attention to this specific situation, and I want you to know that directly." Not in the way of someone who had cultivated size deliberately, though the breadth of his shoulders and the density of his physical presence suggested a body that had been shaped by environments requiring a certain kind of readiness. He wore a dark suit that fit him exactly, and a wool overcoat that he did not remove, and he had dark hair going silver at the temples, and a face that was handsome in the way of someone for whom the handsomeness was incidental to everything else his face communicated, which was primarily that he was a man accustomed to absolute control of his environment and had arrived in a location where the environment was not yet under his control and was managing this fact with the specific, cold patience of someone who had learned to hold. He looked at the room. He looked at the examination table, which was empty. The body had been returned to the storage unit after she completed her work, as procedure required. He looked at Serena, who was at her desk. He said nothing. She said nothing. He crossed to her desk and stood on the other side of it. The examination room was brightly lit. The lighting in examination rooms was always clinical, overhead, designed to eliminate shadows that might obscure detail, and in the brightness of it, he was fully visible to her, his face and his expression unguarded by the flattering ambiguity of dim light. She read his face with the same attention she brought to the documents and the bodies she worked with every day, completely, without rushing toward a conclusion before she had gathered sufficient information. She looked up at him and held his gaze without performance and without apology, the way she looked at everyone who came to her office expecting something she was not going to provide. He placed one large hand on the edge of her desk. He said, "I was told there would be a report ready." She said, "There is." She slid the folder across the desk toward him. He picked it up. He opened it. He began to read. She watched him read. She had learned, over 12 years, to read the faces of people reading her reports, the specific micro-expressions that crossed a face when documentation confirmed something feared, when evidence clarified something that had been uncertain, when a finding arrived that reorganized the understanding of a situation completely. She had learned what it looked like when a person read something they had hoped not to see and was seeing it anyway. What she saw crossing Dominic Costa's face as he read was not any of the categories she had seen before. What she saw was something more interior, more specific, Something that began as the controlled, tactical attention of a man reading a document for operational information, and that changed, somewhere in the second or third page, into something considerably more personal. His jaw tightened. The hand on the edge of her desk applied slightly more pressure to the surface than it had before. He continued reading. He read for 11 minutes. She had looked at the clock when he opened the folder, and she checked it again when he closed it. She had watched many people read her reports. She had watched police officers read them with the specific, scanning efficiency of professionals looking for the actionable information and setting aside the rest. She had watched prosecutors read them with the focused attention of people building something from the material, assembling the pieces into a structure that would hold in court. She had watched family members read them, the ones who asked for copies, which they were entitled to, and who read them in various states of grief and confusion, and the particular fractured clarity that sometimes arrived after a loss, looking for understanding of the specific thing that had happened to the person they had loved. She had never watched anyone read a report with quite the quality of attention that Dominic Costa brought to it. He read it the way she imagined he read all information that mattered to him, completely, from the beginning to the end, without skimming, without jumping ahead, processing each section before moving to the next, with the absolute focused concentration of someone who had learned in his profession that incomplete reading of important information was the first step toward consequential errors. He read for 11 minutes. She had looked at the clock when he opened the folder, and she checked it again when he closed it. He set it on the desk between them. He said, very quietly, "You understand what this says?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And you understand what you have done by writing it?" She said, "I have done my job. The report reflects what the evidence shows. I don't write reports that reflect something other than what the evidence shows. I haven't in 12 years, and I won't begin tonight." He looked at her. The quality of his attention was not threatening, which she noted, because it would have been reasonable for it to be threatening, and the absence of that quality in a man of his position reading what he had just read was information. He said, "Marco was my nephew." He said it flatly, not with the performance of grief, not with the controlled display of a man demonstrating that he was capable of feeling, but with the specific, compressed flatness of a man who is stating a fact that costs him something to state, and who is managing the cost through the familiar mechanism of reduction. Make the sentence small, make it simple, make it a fact rather than a feeling, because feelings in the context of his professional life had always been things to be managed rather than expressed, and the habit was too deep to fully suspend even here, even now. She said, "I know. I identified him at approximately 1:30 this morning." He said, "You know who I am?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And you still signed this report?" She said, "I signed it because it is accurate." "The reason you expected a different report is that you expected me to arrange the furniture around the leak. I don't do that." She said it in the same register she had used throughout, the register of someone making an observation rather than a declaration, communicating information rather than performing a position. She was not trying to be impressive. She was not aware of herself in this moment as a person making a brave choice or holding a principled line against a powerful man. She was simply describing accurately what she did and did not do, because describing it accurately was the same as doing it correctly. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, very briefly, a fraction of a second, the specific involuntary response of someone who has heard something they were not prepared for in the form they were not prepared for it. Then he picked up the folder and he left. The 48 hours that followed were the hours she had been prepared for and was not, in the event, fully prepared for. She had understood when she signed the report that she was choosing a specific kind of exposure. She was in the business of knowing what happened to people who knew things they were not supposed to know, and she understood that the information in her report was precisely that category of knowledge, information that gave her a claim on a situation she had no safe way to hold. She had signed it anyway, for the same reason she had always done her job the way she had always done her job. Because the alternative was to become something she was not prepared to become, and the exposure that came with her choice was the cost of that refusal. She had not told anyone at work about what she had written and why. The report was in the case file, accessible through the standard documentation system, and anyone who read it would understand what it said. But she had not made it the subject of conversation, had not explained herself to the night supervisor or to the colleague she passed in the corridor at the end of her shift. This was partly professional habit. She did not discuss case details outside of appropriate channels, and partly something more specific. She understood that the fewer people who knew she had been the one to make this choice, the more manageable the exposure was for everyone. She was the one who had chosen to write what she had written. The exposure was hers. She was not interested in distributing it to people who had not made that choice. She noticed the car outside her apartment building on the first evening after Dominic's visit. A dark sedan, not quite positioned the way a resident's car would be positioned, with the specific quality of stillness of a vehicle that had been placed there deliberately. She noted it without reacting to it, with the specific professional flatness of a woman who had spent 12 years making herself difficult to read in situations where being readable carried costs. She went to work the next morning. She completed her scheduled cases, 2 unrelated deaths, both straightforward, both requiring the same thorough attention she gave everything. And she found, in the act of doing ordinary work in the middle of an extraordinary situation, the specific grounding quality of a function that did not change based on what was happening around it. She wrote accurate reports. She documented what the evidence showed. She signed her name to what she had written. The ordinary work was the same work it always was, and doing it was, in its small, practical way, a restatement of the position she had stated with the Costa report. This is what I do, and the circumstances around it do not change what it is. She returned home, and the sedan was still there, possibly the same one or a different one that had taken its position. She made herself dinner. She went to bed at a reasonable hour because panicking did not change the situation, and sleep deprivation would impair the function that was currently, potentially, her best protection. On the second day, the car was gone. She did not know what this meant. She held the possibilities. The surveillance had been satisfied by what it needed to assess, or the situation it had been monitoring had resolved, or she was wrong about the car's purpose, and it had simply been an ordinary resident's vehicle parked in an ordinary way. She weighed these possibilities with the same analytical attention she brought to wound profiles and tissue samples, and she concluded that the most probable explanation was the first, that something had been decided, and that her status in relation to whatever was being decided had shifted, but that she could not be certain, and that uncertainty was something she would need to carry for an indeterminate period. She did not know what this meant. She continued working. On the third day, Dominic Costa came back. He came in the evening after her shift had ended, as she was completing the documentation from the afternoon's work. He came alone this time. No men outside the door, no overcoat. In a suit that was slightly less perfect than the one he had worn 2 nights before. The suit of a man who had spent 48 hours in his clothes doing something that had required the full weight of his attention. He looked, she registered when he came through the door, different from how he had looked 2 nights before. Not different in the way of someone who had slept badly or eaten poorly, Those were the ordinary differences she was accustomed to reading in the bodies of people who had been through difficult periods. He looked different in the way of someone who has been through something significant and has come out the other side of it still standing, but with a slightly altered quality of posture. The posture of a person who has put down a weight they have been carrying and has not yet fully adjusted to the new balance. He had spent 48 hours doing what needed to be done. She did not know the details and did not need to know them. She could read the outcome in the specific quality of the exhaustion in his face, which was not the open, unresolved exhaustion of someone still in the middle of a crisis, but the flatter, more contained exhaustion of someone who has brought a thing to its conclusion. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. It was a plain chair, not designed for guests, and he occupied it with the same complete, unself-conscious ease she had observed in the first visit, the ease of a man for whom the quality of the furniture he sat on had never been something he needed to manage. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. It was a plain chair, not designed for guests, and he occupied it with the same complete, unself-conscious ease she had observed in the first visit, the ease of a man for whom the quality of the furniture he sat on had never been something he needed to manage. He said, "It was Caruso." She said, "I don't know who that is." He said, "The man who killed Marco. He has been with my organization for 22 years. He was Marco's godfather. He believed Marco was planning to speak to federal investigators. He was wrong. Marco wasn't. Caruso acted on bad information, and he acted on it without coming to me, which means he made a decision that wasn't his to make, and he made it about a boy who was 24 years old and who trusted him." Serena said nothing. She listened. He told her what he had learned about Caruso over the 48 hours. Not all of it she understood, but the parts that were relevant to her understanding of what had happened to the report she had written and why she was now, according to him, safe. Caruso had been with the organization since Dominic was 22. He had been trusted completely. The specific nature of that trust over 22 years had given him access to information and to people that had made him, in the end, more dangerous than any external threat, because external threats were anticipated and planned for, and Caruso was not an anticipated threat. He had been, until 48 hours ago, part of the planning. He said, "I found this because of what you wrote. The specific details in your report, the caliber, the residue pattern, the distance analysis. When I put those against what I knew about my own people, there was only one person it could have been. Your report told me where to look." She said, "I wrote what the evidence said. I didn't write it for any particular purpose beyond that." He said, "I know." She said, "How did you find out it was him, if he had been with you for 22 years? He said, "I asked him, directly." She held his gaze for a moment. She understood, from the flatness of his delivery, what directly meant in this context, and she did not pursue it further, because pursuing it further was not her function, and was not information she was equipped to do anything useful with. He said, "You're safe. I wanted to tell you that in person. I wanted you to hear it from me, and not from a phone call or a message through someone you've never met." She said, "I appreciate that." He said, "You took a significant risk." She said, "I did my job." He said, "You could have written the other report. People have. You didn't." She said, "I told you." I don't arrange furniture around leaks. I find the leak, and I document where it is. What happens after that is someone else's department. He looked at her with the complete, direct attention she had observed in both of his visits. The specific quality of a man who listened with his whole self when he decided something was worth listening to. who did not perform attention, but exercised it. He said, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Yes." He said, "In 12 years, how many times has someone expected a different report from you?" She thought about this. She said, 7 times where the expectation was communicated directly or nearly directly. More times where it was implicit. He said, "And you have never." She said, "Never." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Why not? I'm asking genuinely, not as a challenge." She looked at him. She thought about her mother, about the phrase for arranging furniture around leaks, about the specific, particular way she had been raised to understand the difference between what was convenient and what was true. She said, "I grew up on the South Side. My neighborhood sent a lot of people through this office over the years. Some of them I knew. Some of them were people whose families I knew. When I was 16, a boy who lived 2 streets from us came through this office, and the report that was written about him said something that wasn't accurate, and the inaccuracy served the interests of people who wanted a particular conclusion. And his family spent years trying to understand what had happened to him, without ever getting a true answer, because the only person with the full truth had chosen not to write it down." She paused. She said, "I decided when I took this job that I would not be the person who made that choice. That is all. It is not complicated." He looked at her. She could see in his expression that he understood she was not performing this, not making herself larger or more morally significant than she was, not constructing a narrative around her choices. She was describing a decision made at a specific moment in response to a specific experience, maintained through 12 years of specific occasions to unmake it. He said, "Because the dead are the last patient I'll ever have for each case. They can't speak for themselves. What I write is the last time anyone will say formally and on record what happened to them. If I write it wrong, for someone else's convenience, then what happened to them disappears. It becomes whatever the convenient version is. And I'm not able to do that." Dominic Costa looked at her for a long time. He said, "Marco was a good kid. He was 24. He was planning to go back to school. He said it the way people say things that they have been not saying for several days, and that have accumulated a weight from not being said, that makes saying them finally a kind of relief, even when the content of them is painful. He said it simply, without the management that he applied to almost everything he communicated, and the simplicity of it was its own kind of information about who Marco Costa had been to him. He said, Marco was a good kid. He was 24. He was planning to go back to school. His mother, my sister, she hasn't slept since he died. She's been asking me for 4 days what happened, and I've been telling her I'm finding out. Now I know. And what I know is what's in your report, which is the truth, because you were the only person in this process who decided the truth mattered more than the convenience." Serena held his gaze. She said, "I'm sorry about your nephew." He said, "Yes." The room was quiet for a moment. He said, "Is there anything you need? Not as payment, not as gratitude. As a practical matter. If your position here becomes difficult because of what you wrote." She said, "My position here is my own business." He said, "I know. I'm asking anyway." She said, "If it becomes difficult, I'll manage it." He said, "All right." He stood. He looked at the examination room around them, the lights, the surfaces, the specific, functional austerity of a space designed for a very particular kind of truth-telling. He looked around the examination room one more time. the stainless steel surfaces, the ordered equipment, the specific functional absence of any decoration or concession to comfort, because comfort was not the function of the space, and anything that suggested otherwise would have been dishonest about what happened here. It was a room built entirely around a single purpose, and the purpose was visible in every detail of its design. He said, "I've been in a lot of rooms in my life. Rooms where things were decided, where information was exchanged, where people said things that cost them something to say. This is the first time I've been in a room like this one." She said, "Most people try not to be in a room like this one." He said, "I understand why. It doesn't seem like a room that allows for the usual arrangements." She said, "It doesn't. That's the point of it." He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, but was in the vicinity of one. The specific configuration of a face discovering, in an unexpected place, that it has been given something it values. He said, "Good night, Dr. Cole." She said, "Good night, Mr. Costa." He paused at the door. He turned back one more time. He said, "The report, what you wrote. It will be used appropriately by the right people to close this correctly. I want you to know that what you documented will not disappear into the same kind of arrangement you refused to create." She looked at him across the examination room. She said, "I wrote it for Marco. Whatever happens with it is not my department, as I said. But I appreciate you telling me." He nodded once, the single, decisive nod of a man who has said what he came to say. He left. She sat at her desk for a while after the sound of his footsteps had faded. She thought about Marco Costa, 24 years old, going back to school, his mother not sleeping. She thought about the report in the case file, 12 pages of accurate documentation of what had ended his life, signed with her name in the bottom right corner of the last page. She thought about Caruso, 22 years, godfather, bad information, a decision that wasn't his to make about a boy who had trusted him. She thought about Dominic Costa sitting in the plain chair across her desk saying, "I asked him directly," and the specific flatness of those 3 words and what they contained. She thought about her mother's phrase, "The furniture arranged around the leak still there." She turned off her desk lamp. She put on her coat. She collected her bag. She thought about all of this in the quiet of the office, at the desk where she had signed her name to 12 years of inconvenient truths, and she found, sitting with it, that she felt neither the satisfaction of vindication nor the relief of danger past. She felt, mostly, tired in the specific way of someone who has done a demanding thing and is ready for the next thing, and is not yet sure when the next thing will arrive. She thought about Marco Costa, and she thought about his mother, and she thought about 24 being a very young age at which to be killed by someone you had trusted. And she thought about the specific, functional anger that had been part of her motivation when she began writing the report at 1:30 in the morning. The anger not at any individual, but at the specific assumption contained in the message through the chain of intermediaries, that her professional judgment was a thing that could be redirected by the application of the right kind of pressure. She was 41 hours into this anger. It had not diminished. She walked out through the examination room, past the rows of cases in their ordered sequence, past the documentation and the evidence and the careful, accumulated record of what had happened to people who could no longer speak for themselves, and she went home through the Chicago night, which was cold and clear and entirely indifferent to the specific calculations that had been made that evening and to the woman who had made them. She had done her job. She had done it the same way she had done it for 12 years, in the same room, with the same commitment to the same principle, and the principle had not changed, and she did not expect it to change. She had thought, when she was young, that her career would be defined by exceptional cases, the cases that tested her, the cases that required more than the standard professional response, the cases that became the stories you told when someone asked you what the work was like. And some of them had been those cases. But what she had learned over 12 years was that the work was mostly not those cases. The work was mostly the ordinary cases, the straightforward cases, the cases that required thoroughness rather than brilliance, consistency rather than courage. It was the accumulation of all the ordinary cases, done with the same attention as the extraordinary ones, that produced the professional, that made the extraordinary cases possible to meet correctly when they arrived, because the muscles required had been built through daily use rather than reserved for special occasions. The Costa case would probably become one of the stories she told eventually to someone who asked what the work was like. She would probably describe it simply, without drama, the way she described everything. The message that arrived, the report she found herself writing, the man who came to read it. She would probably not mention that she had been afraid, because she had not been afraid exactly, or not afraid in the way people expected when they heard the story. She had been aware, which was different, had understood the specific nature of the exposure with complete clarity, and had made her choice in full understanding of what it was. That was the accurate description of what had happened. It was also enough. Tomorrow there would be other cases, other bodies, other truths that needed to be written down by someone who was willing to write them. She would be there. She was always there. She had been working for several weeks after Dominic Costa's second visit, when the night supervisor mentioned, in the specific, oblique way that certain information circulated in their building, that there had been a development in the Costa case, not in the official file, which remained as she had written it, but in the peripheral, ambient way that developments in certain categories of cases were understood by the people who worked adjacent to them. There had been, he said, a resolution. He did not elaborate, and she did not ask him to. She noted this without reaction. She returned to her current case, which was entirely unconnected to any of this, and which required the same thorough, unhurried attention as everything else. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday afternoon, a package arrived at the office with her name on it, no return address, delivered by a courier who could not be traced through the standard channels she would have used to trace him if she had been inclined to try. Inside the package was a brief note, handwritten on plain paper, that said only, "Marco's mother has been told the truth. She asked me to find the person responsible. She wants you to know that she is grateful." There was no signature. She folded the note. She placed it in a drawer. She went back to work. She thought about Marco Costa's mother, who had not slept since her son died, who had been asking for 4 days what happened. She thought about what it meant to be told the truth about a loss, not the convenient truth, not the arranged truth, but the actual truth, the thing that had actually happened, written down by someone who had decided it needed to be written down, even when writing it down was not the easier choice. She thought it was worth something. She thought it was worth quite a lot, actually, even if the specific cost of it was not something she could fully calculate, and the specific benefit of it was not something she could fully see from where she was sitting. She went back to work. If this story reached something in you, if you understood, sitting in that examination room, what it costs to tell the truth when the truth is inconvenient for powerful people, and you are the only one in the room who decides it has to be told, then this channel is exactly where you belong. We tell stories about people who do their jobs completely, even when completely is the dangerous option. Subscribe right now and hit the notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that integrity is not a virtue reserved for easy situations. The next story is already here.